My parents chose to skip my son's funeral so they could attend my brother's backyard pool party. Instead, so I made a decision that ensured they'd never be able to forget the heartless choice they made that day, no matter how hard they try to pretend it didn't happen. At the graveside of my 6-month-old son, I stood completely alone. My parents, meanwhile, were at my brother's poolside gathering. "He's just a baby," my mother had dismissed. "Your brother's party is more significant." They had no comprehension of the profound repercussions that awaited their betrayal. I'm David, 29 years old, and I was utterly isolated at the interment for my infant son, while my parents and sibling were enjoying a pool party. Before I recount how I ensured they would bear the burden of that decision for the rest of their days, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It helps to feel connected, not just speaking into emptiness. The wind. That day was sharp. It was one of those late summer afternoons that couldn't settle on whether to cling to warmth or surrender to the approaching autumn. It swirled around the tiny white coffin, a container far too small to hold a lifetime of aspirations. My wife, Sarah, was by my side, her hand gripping mine so tightly that feeling had left my fingers. Yet I felt a million miles distant from her, from everyone. I was encased in a sphere of silence, surrounded by her devoted family and a few close companions. But the silence was most profound where my own family should have been. My mother, my father, my older brother, Eric. Their absence was a tangible presence, a gaping void beside me that the wind seemed to wail through. Inside my head, however, it was far from quiet. My mother's voice replayed incessantly, the words she'd uttered to me on the phone just 2 days prior, as keen and chilling as a razor's edge. "He's just a baby, David. You can have another one. Eric's engagement celebration is a unique event. We can't let him down. It's just a baby." Each time the words echoed, a fresh wave of nausea swept over me. I watched the diminutive casket being lowered into the earth, and I felt something within me shatter. It wasn't merely sorrow. It was something colder, harder. It was the conclusive, devastating confirmation of a truth I had spent my entire existence attempting to deny. To them, I was secondary, an afterthought, and by extension, so was my son, my James. Later that evening, the house was stiflingly quiet. The casseroles from Sarah's mother remained untouched on the counter. The sympathy cards felt like an insult. Sarah had cried herself to sleep, her face pale and drained on the pillow beside me. I was simply staring at the ceiling, numb, when my phone vibrated on the nightstand. I picked it up. It was a photo message from Eric, a selfie. He and his fiancée, Stephanie, were beaming, sunglasses on, drinks by the pool. The sun was brilliant behind them, and beneath the image, a single line of text. "Wish you were here, bro." I checked the timestamp. It was sent during the precise hour of my son's funeral. Sarah stirred beside me, her breath catching in a sob, even in her slumber. I gazed from her sleeping form to the illuminated screen in my hand, and in that moment, the grief that had hollowed me out began to transform. It was no longer warm and sorrowful. It was cold, clear, and sharp as glass. It was the genesis of a scheme. They had chosen to dismiss my son. I would guarantee they could never dismiss the reality of their choice. To grasp why a pool party could ever outweigh a burial, you must understand my family. For as long as I can recall, my world operated on an unstated set of guidelines, and the primary rule was, Eric comes first. Eric was the favored child. He was 3 years older, louder, more captivating. He was the sun, and I was merely a satellite caught in his orbit, reflecting a sliver of his radiance but possessing none of my own. My parents, Richard and Margaret, were not malicious individuals in the conventional sense. They were simply oblivious. They viewed Eric's potential as a reflection of their own accomplishments, and my quiet, steady nature as a disappointment. I recall one year in high school, it must have been my sophomore year. I had toiled tirelessly, late nights studying, sacrificing weekends. I earned admission into the state's advanced honors program. It was a significant achievement, a gateway to scholarships. I returned home, my acceptance letter clutched in my hand, my heart pounding with a desperate need for a simple, "Well done, son." I found them in the living room. "Mom, Dad, I got in," I announced, extending the letter. My mother, Margaret, merely glanced at it. "Oh, that's nice, Dave," she said, her eyes already surveying the room, searching for my brother. "That's truly nice," my father, Richard, grunted from behind his newspaper. Just then, Eric burst through the door, his soccer bag slung over his shoulder, face flushed with perspiration. "We won! I scored the winning goal in the last 30 seconds!" It was as if a switch had been flipped. My father tossed aside his paper. "That's my boy," he boomed, pulling Eric into a hug. My mother was beaming, her face illuminated with a pride I had never seen directed at me. "Oh, Eric, we must celebrate. I'll call the neighbors, we'll fire up the grill." My acceptance letter was still in my hand, feeling as flimsy and valueless as a used napkin. I quietly folded it, slipped it into my pocket, and went up to my room. That was the dynamic. His triumph was a cause for a neighborhood celebration. My achievement was merely nice. Things began to shift for me when I attended college. That's where I met Sarah. Meeting her was like stepping from a dimly lit gray room into bright sunshine, and encountering her family was even more astonishing. The first time I had dinner at their house, I was terrified. In my home, dinners were quiet, tense affairs, filled with unspoken sentiments. At Sarah's, the house was filled with sound, with laughter, with people talking over one another. Her father, Mark, inquired about my engineering courses, and he actually listened to the answer. Her mother, Carol, embraced me when we departed, a casual gesture of affection that felt entirely foreign and overwhelmingly kind. I witnessed what a family was supposed to feel like. It was a place where you were truly seen. A few years later, Sarah and I married. When we informed my parents that we were expecting, their reaction was predictably lukewarm. It was during a video call. We held up the ultrasound image, our faces aching from smiling. "Oh," my mother said, forcing a small smile. "That's nice. Well, you're not getting any younger." Then, without missing a beat, "Did Eric tell you he's up for a major promotion at his sales firm?" The remainder of the call revolved around Eric, always about Eric. But Sarah's parents, they erupted with joy. Her mother began planning the baby shower that very night. They were a consistent, warm presence throughout the pregnancy. The night. We told them, though, something occurred that should have been a final warning. We were concluding the video call with my parents. We had exchanged our goodbyes, and I was about to press the red end call button, but I hesitated for a second. And in that second, I distinctly heard my mother's voice speaking to my father, believing we were no longer connected. She let out a long, weary sigh. "Another complication," she stated. "I just hope this doesn't interfere with Eric's engagement plans." Sarah and I simply looked at each other, her eyes filled with a hurt that mirrored my own. I felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in my stomach. Complication? My child, our joy, was merely a potential inconvenience to my brother's future. I should have ended it there. I should have erected a barrier around my new family and never looked back. But I didn't. I still clung to that foolish, childish hope that a grandchild, their first grandchild, would alter everything. That a baby would finally be enough to make them truly see me. It was a naive expectation. James was born in January. He was flawless. He had Sarah's bright eyes and a small tuft of my dark hair. Sarah's parents were constantly visiting, taking pictures, assisting with late-night feedings, simply immersing themselves in the happiness he brought. My parents visited twice. The first time, they held him awkwardly for perhaps 5 minutes, before my mother returned him to Sarah, appearing relieved. "He's very small," was her sole remark. The second time, they stayed for 20 minutes, and spent 19 of them discussing Eric's recent vacation to the Bahamas. 2 months before James passed away, Eric announced his engagement to Stephanie. It was like a royal proclamation. My parents immediately went into overdrive, organizing an elaborate engagement party. The date they selected was the same weekend we had scheduled James's church dedication. When I highlighted the conflict, my mother was dismissive. "Oh, David, don't be dramatic. You can reschedule the dedication, it's just a minor church event. Eric's engagement party is a once-in-a-lifetime occasion, all our friends will be there." Her words lingered in the air between us. A minor church event. My son's introduction to our faith, a celebration of his existence, was a trivial matter that could be pushed aside. I argued, but it was like conversing with a stone wall. In their universe, the hierarchy was absolute. Eric's party was the sun. My son's dedication was a distant, flickering star. We rescheduled. We always did. We rearranged our lives to fit into the spaces Eric left behind, and I was beginning to comprehend that one day, there wouldn't be any space remaining at all. The night we lost James was eerily unremarkable. Sarah, a pediatric nurse, was meticulous about everything. We adhered to every SIDS guideline precisely. Back to sleep, firm mattress, no blankets, nothing in the crib. We had a routine: bath, bottle, a gentle lullaby, and then we'd lay him down in his crib in the nursery, his tiny chest rising and falling in the soft glow of the nightlight. That night was no different. I kissed his forehead. He smelled of baby powder and milk. "Good night, little man," I whispered. I awoke at 6 a.m. to the sound of our alarm. Sarah was already up, preparing for her shift at the hospital. I entered the nursery to get James up for his morning feeding. The silence hit me first. Usually by this time he'd be stirring, making small grunting sounds. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, leaning over the crib. He was still. I touched his cheek. It was cool. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through me. I scooped him up. He was limp in my arms. "Sarah!" I screamed. My voice didn't sound like my own. The next hour was a blur of frantic CPR, the piercing wail of sirens, the controlled chaos of paramedics filling our small house. At the hospital, they led us to a small, quiet room, the kind of room they only utilize for one reason. A doctor, with kind, sorrowful eyes, informed us of what we already knew. "I'm so sorry. He's gone." The world simply ceased. All color drained from it, leaving only shades of gray. I held Sarah as she collapsed, her body racked with soundless sobs. My own grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I couldn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I knew I had to make the calls. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely dial. I called my mother first. She answered on the second ring. "David, it's early. Is everything okay?" My throat was tight. "Mom, it's James." I could barely utter the words. He didn't wake up this morning. We're at the hospital. He's gone, Mom." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not the shocked, horrified gasp I anticipated, not the immediate, "We're on our way." Just silence. Then her voice, flat and distant, as if I were telling her about a traffic jam. Oh, Dave, that's terrible." That was it. No questions, no tears, no offer to come and be with us. Just, "That's terrible." I waited, expecting more, but nothing came. "Mom, yes, well, this is just awful news, David, just awful. Listen, I have to run. We're meeting the caterer for Eric's party this morning. Your father and I will call you later." The line went dead. I stood there in the sterile hospital corridor, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Sarah was watching me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What did she say?" she whispered. I couldn't even form the words. I simply shook my head. The next few days were a nightmare of funeral preparations, selecting a tiny casket, choosing a suit, for a baby who would never mature into it. Every decision was another wound to the heart. I called my mother again to inform her of the date and time of the funeral. Her response sealed everything. "Oh, David, we can't," she said, and her voice held a note of genuine frustration, as if I were the one being difficult. "That's the same day as Eric's engagement party, the pool party at the club. We've sent out invitations, everything is paid for." I was speechless. My mind simply refused to process what I was hearing. You're choosing a party," I finally stammered. "A pool party over your grandson's funeral?" And that's when she uttered the words that would be seared into my memory forever. "David, try to be reasonable. He's just a baby. You're young, you can have another one. But Eric's engagement, this party, it's important. It's about his future. We can't let him and Stephanie down. They've been planning this for months." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles were stark white. Sarah, hearing my side of the conversation, began to weep again, a low, wounded sound. I don't recall what I said next. I think I just hung up. The decision was so monstrous, so fundamentally inhumane, that it fractured something deep within. Me. 2 weeks after I stood alone at my son's grave, my mother called, her voice breezy and cheerful, as if nothing had transpired. "We're having our usual Sunday dinner, David. You and Sarah should come. It's time to return to normalcy." I don't know why I went. Perhaps some small, foolish part of me needed to witness it for myself, needed to see the full extent of their denial. Sarah declined, and I didn't fault her, so I went alone. I entered a house buzzing with wedding discussions. Stephanie was displaying color swatches. Eric was talking about his honeymoon plans. My parents were beaming. There was no mention of James. No. "How are you holding up, son?" His name was never uttered. It was as if he had never existed. I couldn't bear it anymore. I stood up in the middle of the living room. "Are you serious?" My voice was low, but it cut through the chatter. Like a blade. Are you all just going to pretend he never happened? My mother's face hardened. David, you're making a spectacle. A spectacle? I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. My son is dead. You missed his funeral for a pool party. I think that warrants a spectacle. That's when my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, spoke up. Now, David, she said in her preachy, self-righteous tone, your parents were very upset. They were too unwell to attend. They told us all about it. I stared at my mother. The falsehood was so blatant, so effortless. She didn't even flinch. She simply offered a slight, sad nod, as if accepting sympathy for an illness she never had. That was it. That was the final component. It wasn't merely a monstrous choice born of favoritism. It was a calculated deception designed to safeguard their own image. They hadn't just forsaken me. They had actively rewritten history to erase their betrayal. I walked over to the mantel where my mother kept her prized collection of family photos. Eric's graduation, Eric's first car, Eric's awards. There was one small framed photograph of James. She had insisted I give her the silver rattle his grandmother had presented him, which sat next to it. I picked up the rattle, its weight feeling solid and real in my hand. I came for this, I stated, my voice cold and unwavering. I looked at my mother, at my father, at the entire family who sat there staring at me. You can keep the pictures. I exited the door and did not look back. The objective wasn't just about truth anymore. It was about retribution. The ensuing weeks were a hazy shroud of sorrow. I felt adrift, lost in an ocean of pain. Sarah was my anchor. She was grieving too, of course, a deep mother's sorrow that I could only witness, not fully comprehend. But she observed that I was drowning in a different way. I was being dragged under by a lifetime of emotional neglect that had finally culminated in this ultimate act of abandonment. You need to speak to someone, David, she suggested one night, her voice gentle but firm. Someone who isn't me, someone outside of this. She was correct. I found a grief counselor, a man named Dr. Miller. He was a quiet, thoughtful man in his late 60s with kind eyes that had witnessed considerable suffering. In our first session, I simply poured it all out. The entire narrative, the honors program, the engagement party, the phone calls, the lie about being unwell. I expected him to focus on my sorrow for James, but he concentrated on something else. David, he said, leaning forward, what you're describing is a classic narcissistic family system. Your parents, particularly your mother, display strong narcissistic tendencies. Eric is the golden child, the extension of their ego, and you? He paused. You have been cast in the role of the scapegoat. You exist to absorb the family's problems and to make the golden child appear better by comparison. Hearing it identified, clinical and precise, was a strange kind of relief. It wasn't just me being overly sensitive. It wasn't something I had imagined. It was a pattern, a recognized toxic dynamic. Your aim right now, Dr. Miller continued, shouldn't be to try and make them comprehend. A true narcissist is often incapable of genuine empathy or self-reflection. You can't make them love you or value you in the way you require. But he looked at me intently. You can stop allowing their opinion to define you. Your goal isn't revenge, David. It's truth and liberation. Truth and liberation. Those words became my guiding principle. My focus shifted. I was no longer a son attempting to earn his parents' affection. I was an archivist, a historian of my own anguish. The plan I'd begun to formulate in my mind became clearer, more systematic. My first step was to call Linda. She was a long-standing friend of my mother's, a woman I had always known to possess a good heart. I knew she had been at the pool party. I hesitated for a week before making the call, my thumb hovering over her name in my contacts. I was apprehensive about what I would hear. When she answered, her voice was hesitant. David. Oh, honey. I'm so sorry about your loss. It's just unimaginable. Thank you, Linda, I said, my own voice steady. I have to ask you about Eric's party. I need to know. There was a lengthy pause, and then I heard her take a shaky breath. Oh, David, she whispered, and her voice was thick with guilt. It was a beautiful party. Everyone was so happy. Margaret and Richard were just beaming. They were holding court, you know. So proud. I closed my eyes, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. Did they mention us? Mention James? No, honey, not a word. It was all about Eric and Stephanie and the wedding. She paused, again. But there was one thing. I overheard Richard talking to some of his old college buddies. He was boasting about Eric's sales figures, and then he pointed at Eric across the pool and said, "That one, he's like me. He knows what's really important in life." The line went cold in my hand. He knows what's really important. The words twisted in my gut. It wasn't just that they favored Eric. It was that my father saw himself in Eric, and he saw a failure, a disappointment in me. My quiet life, my stable career in a field I cherished. It was an indictment of his own unfulfilled ambitions. It was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about love. It was about ego. And my son's life had been sacrificed at the altar of my father's fragile pride. I thanked Linda, my voice hoarse, and hung up. I now possessed everything I needed, not for vengeance, but for the truth. The phone call was deceptively simple. I called my mother. Her voice was cautious, as it had been ever since the day I'd walked out of her house with the silver rattle. "David," she said. "Mom," I replied, my tone even, almost businesslike. "Sarah and I think it's time we all sat down and had a discussion as a family to address things moving forward. We need to do it at your house this Sunday." There was a pause. I could hear the gears turning in her head. A family talk initiated by me was a sign of concession in her mind. It meant I was ready to re-enter the fold, to sweep things under the rug. This was her opportunity to re-establish control. "Of course, David," she said, her voice softening, magnanimous in her perceived triumph. "That's a wonderful notion. We'll be here." My next call was to Pastor Thomas. He was the elderly pastor who had baptized James, a man whose quiet wisdom and moral authority were respected by everyone in our community, especially my parents. They valued their image as devout, church-going individuals. "Pastor," I said, "my family is having a gathering this Sunday to try and heal. I know it's a lot to ask, but your presence there would mean the world to us. We need your guidance." He agreed without hesitation. The stage was set. Sunday arrived, gray and overcast, reflecting the mood in my heart. Sarah's hand was a warm, steady presence in mine as we approached the front door of the house I grew up in. When my mother opened it, her smile was strained but triumphant. She saw me, her wayward son returning. Then she saw Pastor Thomas walking up the path behind us, and her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion in her eyes before she composed herself. "Pastor, what a pleasant surprise," she said, her voice a little too bright. We all sat in the formal living room, the one reserved for important guests. My father, Richard, sat stiffly in his armchair. Eric and Stephanie sat on the love seat, appearing uncomfortable. My mother sat next to my father, the gracious hostess. It was tense. It was quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't bring charts. Or projectors. I reached into the bag I was carrying and produced a small, simple photo album bound in black leather. I placed it on the coffee table in the center of the room. "I compiled this," I stated, my voice quiet but audible in the silent room, "so we could all be on the same page about the truth." I opened it to the first page. It was a picture of James taken the day he was born. He was tiny, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket, his eyes barely open. Sarah let out a small, choked gasp beside me. I turned the page. It wasn't a photo. It was a high-quality print of a screenshot. A text message. My mother's words, stark and black against the white background. "It's just a baby. You can have another one. Eric's engagement party is a once-in-a-lifetime event." My mother's face turned pale. Richard shifted in his chair. "Now what is this?" He blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. I didn't respond. I simply turned the page again. A beautiful photo of James at 3 months old, smiling a gummy, toothless smile. He was so full of life. Then the next page, the Instagram photo, of Eric and Stephanie grinning at their pool party, the sun glinting off the water behind them, the timestamp clear and damning at the bottom. "This was captured while we were burying my son," I stated, my voice still level. I looked directly at Eric for the first time. I saw a flicker of genuine shame in his eyes. He couldn't meet my gaze. "I don't comprehend what you're attempting to achieve, David," my mother stated, her voice beginning to tremble with fury. "Not sorrow. This is private. How dare you bring this up, especially in front of the pastor?" She was trying to wield shame, her last resort. But Sarah, my quiet, gentle Sarah, found her voice. It was low and it trembled, but it was as strong as steel. "He was my son too, Margaret," she said, looking directly at my mother. "And while I was choosing his casket, you were selecting party favors." That's when the dam broke. "How dare you?" my mother shrieked, leaping to her feet. After everything we've done for you, you are a cruel, ungrateful child. You are trying to tear this family apart. It was the classic narcissist's plea. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was angry that she was exposed. But it was my father's reaction that was the true revelation. He had been silent, his face a mask of stone. But now, as my mother raged, "Against me," he snapped. He didn't look at me. He looked at Eric, his face contorted in a mask of pure, undiluted resentment that I had never witnessed before. "Shut up, Margaret," he roared, his voice cracking. And then the truth, the ugly, pathetic truth he had concealed for 30 years, came spilling out. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "This is his fault. It was always him. He did everything correctly. He went to college, he got the secure job, he built the quiet life I never could." His voice dropped to a raw, guttural whisper. "I failed at his age. I failed. He was never supposed to be better than me." He finally turned his gaze to Eric, his favored child, his face a mixture of fury and despair. "And you were supposed to be like me. You were supposed to desire more." The room fell into a stunning, absolute silence. The only sound was my mother's sharp, incredulous intake of breath. It was all out. The favoritism, the neglect. It wasn't just about affection. It was about my father's own pathetic jealousy. My success was a constant reminder of his failure. Eric's flashy, hollow life was his vicarious redemption. My son, my innocent James, was merely collateral damage in a 30-year conflict my father had been waging with his own reflection. The truth hadn't set me free. It had simply incinerated the prison. The silence that followed my father's admission was heavier than any argument could ever be. It was a dead, suffocating weight, filled with the dust and debris of a family that had just imploded. My father, Richard, seemed to shrink into his armchair, the rage draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated old man. My mother, Margaret, for the first time in her life, was speechless. Her mouth was slightly agape, her eyes wide, with the shock of having her entire world, the narrative she had so meticulously constructed, obliterated in a single, raw confession. Eric looked devastated. He stared at his father not with anger, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. He was beginning to perceive that the pedestal he'd been placed on his whole life wasn't constructed on love, but on his father's weakness. He wasn't the cherished son, he was just the more convenient mirror. Stephanie, the master manipulator, merely looked from Eric to his parents, her face a blank mask. There was no ameliorating this. There were no words to mend it. It was Pastor Thomas who finally broke the quiet. He didn't preach. He didn't lecture. He simply rose, walked over to where Sarah and I were seated, and placed a hand on each of our shoulders. His touch was firm, grounding. He looked at us with a profound sadness and compassion. Then he turned his gaze to my parents, and his expression was one of deep, quiet disappointment. It was more condemning than any fire and brimstone sermon. That was our signal. Sarah and I stood up in unison. The movement felt slow, deliberate. I looked at the faces of my family, these strangers who shared my blood but not my heart. I felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, not even pity, just a vast, quiet emptiness, the space where all that desperate, lifelong need for their approval used to reside. I looked at the black leather album still resting open on the coffee table. The evidence, the truth. It had fulfilled its purpose. "I don't require anything from you anymore," I stated, and my voice was my own again, clear and calm. It was the voice of a man who was no longer a child seeking permission. "I just needed the truth to be heard. Now you all have it. You can live with it however you choose." I took Sarah's hand. It felt like the only genuine thing in the room. My mother finally found her voice, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to pull me back. "David, wait." It was a plea, but it was hollow. The power was gone. We didn't wait. We didn't look back. We walked out of the living room, down the familiar hallway, and out the front door into the cool, gray air. As the door clicked shut behind us, it felt like the final, definitive conclusion to a story. It wasn't a triumphant slamming of the door. It was a quiet closing, the kind you do when you know you will never return. We walked to the car in silence. As I started the engine, I glanced at Sarah. Tears were silently streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of pure anguish. They were tears of release. She placed her hand on my arm. "It's finished," she whispered. "It's finally finished." And she was right. Driving away from that house, I felt a lightness I hadn't realized was possible. The burden I had been carrying on my shoulders my entire life The burden of not being good enough, of being second best, of constantly striving for a prize I could never attain. It was gone. It had been left behind in that silent, shattered living room. The reckoning wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about me finally refusing to pay the cost for their dysfunction. I hadn't won a battle against them. I had simply yielded from a conflict I should never have been compelled to wage, and in that surrender, I discovered my freedom. A year can feel like an eternity, or in our situation, it can feel like the initial year of a new one. The first few months after the confrontation were peaceful. We heard nothing from my family, and we made no effort to connect. The silence was a balm. We concentrated on each other, on navigating the vast expanse of our grief for James together, without the corrosive noise from the outside. We sold our house, the house where we had lost him. It was too full of specters. We relocated to a new town, a place a few hours away where the streets were unfamiliar and we could be anonymous. We could just be David and Sarah. I immersed myself in a project at work. It was a community park, a public space with gardens and play areas. I persuaded the firm to allow me to design a small, secluded section of it as a memorial garden, a quiet spot with a fountain and benches filled with white flowers. I never inscribed a name on it, but I knew it was for James. It was a way to introduce something beautiful and vibrant into the world in his name. About 8 months after what we now simply referred to as that day, Sarah and I began discussing the future. The void in our lives was still present, a tender spot in our hearts that would never completely mend. But our home was too quiet. Our capacity to love was too immense to keep to ourselves. We decided to apply to become foster parents, with the hope of eventually adopting. We knew we couldn't replace James, but we could provide a secure and loving home to a child who required one. The process was lengthy and rigorous, filled with paperwork and interviews, but it was therapeutic. It was proactive. It was us choosing to construct a family on our own terms, a family built on intention and affection, not merely biological obligation. 1 year to the day after the confrontation, we were at the dedication ceremony for the park. It was a sunny Saturday. Families were everywhere. Children were laughing on the new playground equipment. I was standing with Sarah in the memorial garden I had designed. It was serene. The fountain softly gurgled. The white blossoms on the trees fluttered in the breeze. It was a place for calm contemplation for anyone who had ever experienced loss. Sarah squeezed my hand. "It's beautiful, David," she said. "He would have adored it." I felt a familiar pang in my chest, but it wasn't the sharp, stabbing pain it used to be. It was a softer, gentler ache, the ache of remembrance, not of an open wound. As we were about to depart, I saw a solitary figure standing at the edge of the gardens. It was Eric. He appeared different, leaner. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. He looked older than his years. He saw me observing him and took a hesitant step forward, then stopped as if he knew he had no right to approach more closely. "David," he said, his voice quiet. "The garden is nice." I simply nodded, unsure what to say. "I came to," he began, then trailed off, shaking his head. "Stephanie and we didn't make it. The wedding was called off. The whole thing just collapsed after that day. Everything was built on something rotten." He looked down at his shoes. "I'm sorry, David. For the picture, for everything. I was a fool." It was the first genuine apology I had ever received from him in my life. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a justification. It was just a plain, sorrowful admission. I looked at him, my brother, this man who had been both my tormentor and a victim, himself. "I hope you find your way, Eric," I said, and I meant it. His life was his to rectify. It had nothing to do with me anymore. He gave a small, grateful nod and walked away, a solitary figure vanishing into the multitude. 2 months later, we received the call. A baby girl, 6 weeks old. Her name was Lily. We brought her home the next day. Walking into our new dwelling, with this tiny, warm bundle in my arms, I felt a sense of peace I never thought was possible. It wasn't a replacement. It was a continuation. It was a new chapter. Sarah was radiant, her face full of a soft maternal love that was breathtaking to witness again. That night, as I stood over Lily's crib, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, I grasped the truth. My father had been mistaken. I wasn't superior to him. He had been so consumed by his own failures that he couldn't perceive my life for what it was. A choice. I chose a different path, a quieter one perhaps, but it was mine. And it was a life where I understood what was truly significant. It wasn't promotions or festivities or the affirmation of others. It was this quiet, simple, profound love. This family that Sarah and I had opted to construct from the ashes of our deepest anguish. So here we are. It's been nearly 2 years now. Lily is a toddler, a whirlwind of giggles and clumsy movements who fills our home with a chaotic delight that is the most exquisite music I've ever heard. Sarah and we're content. It's a different kind of happiness than we had previously. It's quieter, more resilient. It's a happiness that has known the profoundest sorrow and has chosen to blossom anyway. There's a picture of James on our mantle. He's smiling. He's not a specter that haunts us. He's a gentle presence, a part of our narrative, the son who taught us the unbearable fragility and the incredible fortitude of love. Lily will mature knowing about her brother. Sometimes I think about my former family. Eric sends a simple card on Christmas and birthdays. I hear from a cousin that my parents are still in the same house, residing in the quiet, bitter wreckage of the world they built. I no longer feel anger. I don't feel anything at all. They are figures from a different existence, a story that has already been penned, a book I finally closed and returned to the shelf. I've learned that the family you're born into is merely a starting point. It's the family you create, the family you choose, the family that chooses you back. That's what truly matters. It's the people who appear, not just for the celebrations, but for the interments. It's the people who perceive your pain and sit with you in the darkness, not the ones who tell you to move past it, because it's inconvenient. The journey I undertook wasn't about punishing my parents. Looking back, I recognize that now. It was about liberating myself. It was about standing up and asserting, my pain is authentic. My son's life mattered. My worth is not subject to your discussion or sanction. It was the most challenging, most agonizing thing I've ever had to do, and it was the singular action that salvaged my life. Thank you for listening to my account. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to safeguard your own tranquility? Please share your story in the comments below. It helps to know we are not alone. And if you found any value in this, please consider liking this video and subscribing so you don't miss what's next. Take care of yourselves.